questions. Questions orales. The honourable member for Carleton.
Globe Mail alleges that the Prime Minister's office interfered in order to try and get charges dropped in a massive fraud and bribery case. The corporation in question discussed law enforcement and justice with the Prime Minister's office 14 times, including with PMO boss Gerald Butts. Did Mr. Butts ever discuss with SNC-Lavalin lobbyists the idea of giving the company a deal to avoid criminal prosecution?
Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, at no point has the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been directed or pressured by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to make any decision on this or any other matter. The Attorney General of Canada is the Chief Law Officer of the Crown and provides legal advice to the government with the responsibility to act in the public interest, Mr. Speaker. He takes those responsibilities very seriously.
Well, the Prime Minister told his caucus that any word coming from Gerald Butts should be considered as coming directly from the Prime Minister. The Globe and Mail reports, and I quote, "In December, Mr. Butts spoke to the former Attorney General about the SNC-Lavalin remediation case, according to the Prime Minister's Deputy Communications Director. Apparently, it didn't go well. A month later, the Prime Minister fired his Attorney General. What did Mr. Butts say to the former Attorney General in that conversation?"
Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, at no point has the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone else in the Prime Minister's office. Let me reiterate that, or anyone else in the Prime Minister's office, to make any decision on this or any other matter. The Attorney General of Canada is the Chief Law Officer of the Crown and provides legal advice to the entire Government of Canada. He takes this responsibility to act in the public interest, and that responsibility is one that he takes very seriously.
Honourable member for Carleton.
That was not the question. Gerald Butts is the boss at the PMO. The Prime Minister has told his caucus anything that comes from Gerald Butts comes from the Prime Minister. Now, in December, Mr. Butts talked about SNC-Lavalin's charges with the former Attorney General. So again, my question is very clear. What exactly did Gerald Butts say to the former Attorney General in that December conversation?
Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, at no point has the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone in the Prime Minister's office, including the individual just mentioned by the member from Carleton, to make any decision on this or any other matter. The Attorney General is the Chief Law Officer of the Crown and provides legal advice to the government with the responsibility to act in the public interest. The Attorney General takes this issue very seriously.
Deputy Louis Saint-Laurent.
The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, follow the exposure by the Globe and Mail on this issue. Canadians aren't reassured by the comments being made by the government. The government is playing on words, and Canadians want the facts. So the question that we are asking, that we will continue to ask until Canadians get the answer, is simple. Were there any discussions between the Prime Minister's office and the former Attorney General on SNC-Lavalin? Yes or no? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. I appreciate the question. At no point was the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to make a decision on this or any other matter. The Attorney General of Canada is the Chief Legal Officer of the Crown and has the responsibility to give legal advice to the government in the public interest. The Minister takes these responsibilities very seriously.
Louis Saint-Laurent.
The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Well, I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for the quality of his French, but that was not the question. The question is very simple. Now, the Globe and Mail has added an aspect today. It seems that last December, the main advisor to the Prime Minister, Gerald Butts, had a conversation with the former Attorney General of Canada, and a month later, she was fired from her important duties. So I will repeat the question that all Canadians are asking themselves. Were there any discussions between the Prime Minister's office and the former Attorney General on the SNC-Lavalin scandal? Yes or no? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. First of all, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his comments. I work hard to speak both official languages in this House. To reiterate, at no point has the current or former Minister of Justice pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to make any decision on this matter or any other.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister didn't invent the expression, but he was right when he said sunlight is the best disinfectant. But when faced with evidence of a serious potential obstruction of justice, the Liberals can only deny and delay. A well-connected multinational lobbies this Liberal government more than 50 times, shovels them more than $100,000 in illegal donations, and then gets changes to the criminal code to help them get out from under corruption and fraud charges. And when the former AG doesn't bend to the will of the Prime Minister, she's fired. Liberals should be working with us to get to the bottom of this mess, and instead we get non-answers and resistance. So a very specific question to my friends. Will they support our call for an ethics investigation into this scandal? Yes or no?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we've been abundantly clear. At no point has the Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to make any decision on this or any other matter. The Attorney General is the Chief Law Officer of the Crown and provides legal advice to the Government of Canada, the responsibility to act always in the public interest. He takes those responsibilities seriously.
Skeena Bulkley Valley.
You see that? It doesn't matter what question you ask them. They give you the exact same answer back. By refusing to agree with even the most simple and obvious requests for answers, the Liberals look even more guilty. Let's remind Canadians what we're talking about. Obstruction of justice is the crime of willfully interfering with the process of justice by influencing or threatening a legal officer or a legal process. It comes with a 10-year jail sentence. What we're talking about is the most serious form of corruption and political criminality. This is why people are cynical about politics. This is why people don't trust government. So again, I ask a simple question. Will the Liberals help us get the answers we need and support our call for an investigation into this mess?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I will reiterate for this House, at no point has the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone else in his office to make a decision on this or any other matter. As the Prime Minister said very clearly yesterday to the journalists gathered, the allegations contained in the Globe and Mail article are false.
The
Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, we're not going to pretend that we haven't seen rich companies try to buy the help of politicians by making illegal contributions. After 150 years of Liberal and Conservative governments in Ottawa, it's been there, done that. KPMG, Kinder Morgan, SNC-Lavalin, it's always the same thing. When it comes time to help out their millionaire friends, the Liberals obey the orders of the powerful. Now, if they have nothing to hide, why aren't they asking the Ethics Commissioner to undertake an investigation and to shed light on this scandal? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, at no point has the Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to make any decision on this or any other matter. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, these allegations are false. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, last year in the Budget Implementation Act, the Liberals amended the Criminal Code. Companies accused of corruption can have access to out-of-court agreements. That will guarantee that they'll still have access to lucrative federal contracts. Now, who's often been accused of corruption abroad? SNC-Lavalin. Who talked to the Prime Minister's office 14 times? SNC-Lavalin. When we say that the Liberals are simply puppets for large companies, well, will people finally end up knowing who's just how far their influence goes over the federal government, the Liberal government? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mediation agreements that the member opposite is referencing are something that was widely consulted upon by the Government of Canada. That process was led by PSPC. The remediation agreements were, that consultation concluded during the year of 2017. There was an announcement made in the budget. There was a press release. There was a study done in committee. The government has been entirely transparent with respect to amendments we've made to the laws of Canada with respect to remediation.
Member for Barrie Innisfil.
Mr. Speaker, former Liberal Ontario Attorney General Michael Bryant has made his opinion known just how serious these allegations are and the impact that it's having on our democracy and the judicial system. Now, we found out this morning from the Globe and Mail that the Prime Minister's principal secretary, Mr. Butts, spoke to Ms. Wilson-Raybould about the SNC-Lavalin remediation case, according to the Prime Minister's Deputy Communications Director. So the question is very simple, and it requires a straightforward answer for Canadians. Did the Prime Minister's office discuss a special deal for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General? Yes or no?
I just remind honourable members not to use the family names of other honourable members. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, to be crystal clear, the Principal Secretary, like many others, is a member of the Prime Minister's office. And what I've said is that the Minister of Justice and the previous Minister of Justice have not been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone else in the Prime Minister's office to take any decision on this or any other matter.
Barrie Innisfil.
Well, the questions we're asking, Mr. Speaker, are crystal clear, and we're asking a very simple question that hasn't been answered. It wasn't answered yesterday. It hasn't been answered today. So I'm going to ask again, crystal clearly. Did the Prime Minister's office discuss a special deal for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General? Yes or no?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, at no point has the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to make a decision in this or on any other matter. As the Prime Minister stated clearly yesterday, the allegations contained in the original article in the Globe and Mail are false.
Honourable Haute-Saint-Charles.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg Haute-Saint-Charles. Now, when she was shown the door, the former Attorney General of Canada said that the system of justice must be exempt of all political interference and she must speak power to truth, and that nothing less than the truth is acceptable. Did the Prime Minister's office discuss a special arrangement with the former Attorney General of Canada? Yes or no? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, at no point has the Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to make any decisions on this or any other matter. The Honourable Member. That wasn't the question. Knowing that the rule of the Attorney General carries with it unique responsibilities to uphold the rule of law and the administration of justice, that our system of justice must be free from even the perception of political interference and uphold the highest levels of public confidence, the Attorney General's position must be non-partisan and transparent. So the question is simple, Mr. Speaker. Did the Prime Minister's office discuss a special agreement for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General? Yes or no? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, at no point has the Minister of Justice nor the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to make any decision on this or any other matter. I agree with my colleague opposite that the Attorney General is the Chief Legal Officer of the Crown and has a responsibility to make legal advice to the government in the public interest. The Minister of Justice takes these responsibilities very seriously.
Again, Mr. Speaker, that wasn't the question. The former Attorney General said very clearly, it is a pillar of our democracy that our system of justice be free from even the perception of political interference. Yet we know from the lobbyist commissioner that over a dozen times SNC-Lavalin met with members of the Prime Minister's office, including Principal Secretary Jerry Butts. The Prime Minister says that sunshine is the best disinfectant, so let's shine some sunlight onto this issue. Did the Prime Minister's office discuss a special deal for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General? Yes or no?
Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, to be crystal clear, at no point has the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office, including all employees therein, to make any decision on this or any other matter. The Attorney General is the chief law officer of the Crown, providing legal advice to the government. He takes that responsibility very seriously.
Member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, that clearly wasn't the question. We're not talking about directing or influence, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about discussions. The former Attorney General was clear that, and I quote, "It's a pillar of our democracy that our system of justice be free from even the perception of political interference," end quote. Well, the Canadian public is not confident in this Prime Minister or that Parliamentary Secretary's answer. Were there any discussions of a special deal between the Prime Minister's office and the former Attorney General about SNC-Lavalin? Yes or no?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, at no point, N-O point, has the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or members of his cabinet. I take issue with the member opposite has construed this as not being about pressure or direction. That's exactly what is at issue here. That is exactly what I'm saying on the record, that there was no pressure and no direction given by the Prime Minister or members of his cabinet on this or any other matter.
Malahat Langford.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it was over 20 years ago that the Liberals committed to introducing a universal drug plan, but they failed to act. In the meantime, Mr. Lorenzen in my riding has paid over $25,000 for prescription medication following a surgery. Liberals lack the political will to get the job done. Enough with the studies, enough with the expert panels, enough with the rhetoric. Will they please tell Mr. Lorenzen, indeed all Canadians, are they ready to end the empty promises and implement a fully public, national, and universal pharmacare plan?
Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we agree that Canadians are paying too much for their prescription medicines, but unlike the NDP, we're doing our homework. When it comes to something as big and as important as pharmacare, we want to get it right. Unlike the NDP, we want to know how much something costs before we implement it. Yes. What the NDP unveiled yesterday is not a plan. You can't call something a plan when it has nothing to do about costing or how it will be implemented. Unlike the NDP, we don't do a nation-building policy of pharmacare on the back of a napkin. This is an issue far too serious for half-baked, no detailed plans.
Good job. Member for London, Fanshawe. Order.
More Liberal obfuscation. Canada needs a federal child care program. CCPA's Development Milestones report reveals the distressingly high cost of child care burdens Canadian families. Child care costs are 10 times higher in Toronto than in Montreal. In fact, universal child care in Quebec pays for itself. It's actually created revenue. Yeah. What will it take for this Liberal government to smarten up and implement a national child care program for all Canadian families so everyone wins?
Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to be able to answer this question because we know that investments in affordable and quality childcare make a big impact in order to improve labor force participation by women in particular, make ends meet easier, to improve poverty reduction outcomes, to make gender equality more real in Canada, and to invest in the development of our children. The good news, Mr. Speaker, is that we have announced a $7.5 billion investment, the first time ever, in our daycare center in early learning and childcare, and we're looking forward to implement that over the next 10 years.
For Haldeman, Norfolk.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Attorney General's responsibilities include upholding the rule of law and speaking truth to power. Right. And it's a pillar of our democracy that our system of justice be free from even the perception of political interference. That's right. But yesterday, the Prime Minister's office was accused of trying to interfere with a criminal prosecution against SNC-Lavalin. In December, Gerald Butts discussed a special deal for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General. A month later, she was fired. What was said in that meeting?
The Honourable Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, at no point has the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone in the Prime Minister's office to make any decision on this or any other matter. It does indeed warm my heart to hear now two Conservative colleagues talking about how important the rule of law is, Madam Speaker. I wish they would have recollected those kinds of concepts when they were criticizing openly Beverly McLaughlin when she served as Chief Justice of Canada.
Honourable member for Peace River, Westlock.
Mr. Speaker, something stinks. The Prime Minister's answers are vague and evasive. The former Attorney General spoke truth to power and she paid the price. In December, Gerald Butts discussed a special deal for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General, and a month later, she was fired. What was said at that meeting?
Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice and the former Minister of Justice have not been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone in the Prime Minister's cabinet on this or any other matter. As the Prime Minister said very clearly yesterday in front of a media scrum, the allegations contained in the Globe and Mail article are false.
The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. I'd like to invite my colleague to listen to the question so we can provide a real answer. Now, it was worrisome because yesterday a Globe and Mail article reported on the interference by the Prime Minister's office in a criminal prosecution. Where are the principles of impartiality in our justice system? The principles of ethics and transparency? The question is simple because Gerald Butts in December discussed an agreement with SNC-Lavalin. After that, she was fired. What was said at that meeting? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, at no point has the current Minister of Justice nor the former Minister of Justice been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to make any decisions on this matter or any other.
Member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that wasn't the question, and that carefully crafted answer falls short of what Canadians expect. As the former Attorney General said, the role of the Attorney General of Canada carries with it unique responsibilities to uphold the rule of law and the administration of justice, and as such, demands a measure of principled independence. Apparently, the PM thinks otherwise. In December, Gerald Butts discussed a special deal for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General. A month later, she was fired. What was said in that meeting?
Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, at no point has the current minister or his predecessor been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or members of his office to make any decision in this or any other matter. Absolutely, the member opposite has it right. The Attorney General is the Chief Law Officer of the Crown. Absolutely, they provide legal advice to government, and they have a responsibility to act in the public interest. That's something that the minister takes very seriously.
Berry-sur-Roi.
The Honourable Member for Berry-sur-Roi. Same answer to every question. Mr. Speaker, the municipality of Vaudreuil-Soulanges asked the NEB for a list of non-compliance incidents and for results from follow-up studies about Enbridge's Line 9B. The NDP refused to answer. I myself have tried to get this information through a written request, and this is what I got as an answer. Producing and verifying a detailed response to this question is not possible within the requested timeline and could lead to the disclosure of incomplete or misleading information. Well, gee, do you think the NEB and the Liberals have something to hide? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to the regulation of pipelines, the National Energy Board, the NEB, takes care of that. So if people have questions or concerns about pipelines when it comes to safety, they should speak to the NEB. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Maskinongé. Mr. Speaker, riverbank erosion is not a new phenomenon, but it's gotten worse. Some of my constituents are now worried that their houses could literally fall into the river. Municipalities like Saint-Ignace-de-Loyola have long been calling for the federal government to invest in the maintenance of retaining walls along the riverbank in the St. Lawrence and to better control boat speeds there. This is a real problem, and we're asking for quick action from the federal government today. Will the Liberals do what they need to do and take concrete action to fix this problem? It's urgent. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport.
We understand how important our transportation corridors are for getting goods and people across Canada to market and also to connect with other Canadians. When it comes to individual issues like this one, we're happy to work with all members to ensure that not only our transportation corridors stay open, but that our communities stay protected, and I'm happy to follow up with the member.
For Mississauga Lakeshore.
The Canadian Armed Forces provide unique opportunities to develop and perfect skills that can last a lifetime.
Members of the Reserve Force live and work in their home communities and safeguard them, such as when natural disasters occur. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence inform this House on how the government is partnering with communities to support our reservists and allow them to serve at home and abroad without the stress of repercussion on their full-time civilian roles?
Parliament Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
I want to thank my colleague, the member from Mississauga Lakeshore, for his question. Mr. Speaker, as you know, our government supports our reservists and soldiers.
Legislation with new provision for military training leave and job protection when serving on deployment. Et Monsieur le Président, j'étais au Nouveau.
Mr. Speaker, I was in New Brunswick this weekend to congratulate local businesses and organizations who support our reservists and make it possible for them to serve.
Canadian Forces Liaison Council and its partner for promoting the transferable skill of reservists to civilian jobs and helping them balance their civilian life while gaining valuable military experience that set them up for success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians expect Canada's Attorney General to be independent and nonpartisan. The former Attorney General knows this, and in her words, it is a pillar of our democracy that our system of justice be free from even the perception of political interference. Mr. Speaker, all of these carefully crafted and legally vetted answers regarding the PMO interfering in a criminal investigation and the firing of the former Attorney General are not sufficient. In December, Mr. Speaker, Gerald Butts discussed a special deal for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General. A month later, she was fired. Who said what in that meeting?
Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, as I said several times in this chamber today, no point whatsoever did the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice were they pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone in the Prime Minister's office to make a decision on this or any other matter. Mr. Speaker, I've been patient, but about at least half a dozen times, members opposite have said that the former minister was fired in the context of accepting the honour of taking on serving Canada's veterans. And I think in terms of the men and women who have fought for this country and served so valiantly, I think that is actually an inappropriate statement to be making in this House and should be addressed.
Honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Secretary still hasn't answered the question. I want to go back and quote the former Attorney General. It has always been my view that the Attorney General of Canada must be nonpartisan, more transparent in the principles that are the basis of decisions, and in this respect, always willing to speak truth to power. Shockingly, now it appears the Prime Minister fired the former Attorney General for speaking truth to power. In December, Gerald Butts discussed a special deal for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General. A month later, she was fired. What was said in that meeting?
Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, neither the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice has been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone in the Prime Minister's office to take a decision on this or any other matter. As the Prime Minister was very clear yesterday with the journalists gathered in Vaughan, Ontario, the allegations contained in the Globe and Mail article are false.
River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, that wasn't quite the question answer that we needed, but the reports about the PMO interference in criminal prosecution are shocking. So, in December, Gerald Butts discussed a special deal with SNC-Lavalin with that former Attorney General. A month later, she was demoted. What was said in that meeting? Canadians need to know.
Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, The current Minister of Justice and his predecessor have neither been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone in the Prime Minister's office to make a decision on this or any other matter. Clearly, the Attorney General is the chief law officer of the Crown and provides legal advice to government with the responsibility to act in the public interest. The Minister takes this responsibility very seriously.
It's Grenville, Thousand Island, and Rideau Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But again, no surprise, that wasn't the answer to the question that was asked. And these reports of PMO interference in a criminal prosecution are deeply troubling. It's no wonder the Prime Minister fired his Attorney General when she called for principled independence and transparency. She said, quote, "It is a pillar of our democracy that our system of justice be free from even the perception of political interference. The pillars of ethics, principle, and transparency have been absent from this government." In December, Gerald Butts discussed a special deal for SNC-Lavalin with the former Attorney General. A month later, she was fired. What was said in that meeting?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary, the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, at absolutely no point has the previous minister or the current minister been pressured or directed by the Prime Minister himself or any members of his office to make any decision on this or any other matter. As the Prime Minister said clearly yesterday to the gathered journalists, the allegations contained in the original media article are false.
Saanich Suk.
Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Forces continue to lose more than one member per month to death by suicide. Yet one of the barriers to serving members getting the help that they need is the fact that self-harm remains a disciplinary offence in the Military Code of Conduct. Since the Liberal members ruled my amendment to fix this out of order at committee hearings on Bill C-77, let me ask the Minister, will the government now support removing self-harm as a disciplinary offence by agreeing to support my private member's bill C-426 and expediting its passage through this House?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, our government is concerned about the health and well-being of soldiers and their families. We recognize that we need to continue to adapt our approach for people who suffer from mental health problems. That's why the Minister invited the National Defence Committee to study the question of suicide and self-harm within the Canadian Armed Forces. The goal is to find recommendations for the government to follow. Taking care of our veterans and soldiers is a priority for our government. The men and women in uniform are always at the heart of what we do.
Member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Mr. Speaker, there's a 60% increase in rejections of disability tax credit applications. The Liberals are not delivering the services needed by thousands of people with severe and prolonged impairments. The disability savings they qualified for as far back as 10 years is also being taken. Clawed back. Nearly 80% of appeals win, and it makes us wonder if this is intentional. The Liberals take care of their friends on Bay Street, and people with disabilities are being ripped off. Will the Liberal government fix this problem now?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of National Revenue.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for the question. Our government recognises that living with a disability can have significant impact on the lives of those affected and their loved ones. That is why we put in place measures to make the disability tax credit more accessible by, for example, reducing the complexity of the form and allowing nurse practitioners to certify the forms of their patients. Our government reinstated the Disability Advisory Committee, which was abolished under the Harper Conservatives, to give people with the disabilities a strong voice in advising the agency. We look forward to receiving the committee's recommendations. Thank you.
For Edmonton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals introduced the accountability-destroying $7 billion Vote 40 Liberal slush fund on the pretense that it would better align government spending. Now, the PBO has once again reported that this measure has been an abject failure. The Liberals killed spending oversight in an election year so they can spend on what they want with zero accountability. Will the new Treasury Board president listen to the Parliamentary Budget Officer and eliminate the Vote 40 Liberal slush fund?
Parliament Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And our government has always been guided by the view that parliamentarians have the right to know where public funds are going and how they're being spent. For the very first time, parliaments have at their disposal a detailed reconciliation between the budget and main estimates. They never had that before. That means when they are studying the main estimates, parliamentarians will now be able to study a document that is relevant and complete for that year. This is a major improvement over previous years when the main estimates were rendered obsolete soon after they were tabled because they didn't reconcile with the budget.
Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, 8-year-old Liam and 9-year-old Mia Terabici were kidnapped. They were taken to a foreign country, and this Prime Minister has done nothing to bring them home. The only hope of ever having these children brought home to their mom, Shelley, is if the Prime Minister calls the President and Prime Minister of Lebanon and asks for them to intervene. These 2 Canadian children need to be home here in Canada with their mom. Why hasn't the Prime Minister called President Owen and Prime Minister Harari?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our thoughts go to the family at the center of an abduction of Canadian children to Lebanon. Canadian consular officials are in direct contact with the family and are providing consular assistance and advice, and due to the provisions of the Privacy Act, no further information can be disclosed at this time.
For Caribou, Prince George.
Seriously, that answer is shameful. 2 Canadian children kidnapped, taken to a foreign country, and that's the answer that we get? Mr. Speaker, in Shelley's own words, the only person that can do something is the Prime Minister, who so far hasn't cared enough to do anything for his own citizens. She says, what do I have to do to be heard? Become a donor? Why won't this Prime Minister just pick up the phone and bring Liam and Mia home?
Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, consular officials are in direct contact with the family. There's a whole host of security issues that surround such cases, and to further talk about the details in public may put lives in jeopardy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, in the last 2 decades, there have been incredible change in the pulp and paper industry.
Between 1990 and 2012, the industry has led the way in reducing pollution by more than 60%. The industry will play a key role in fighting pollution, driving innovation, creating jobs, and advancing Indigenous reconciliation. En soulignant l'importance
in recognizing the importance of this future industry, can the Parliamentary Secretary update this House on the pulp and paper industry?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for her question and her great efforts in French. Good job.
I want to thank the member for promoting this very important issue.
The importance of the forestry sector and provided $867 million through the Softwood Lumber Action Plan due to unfair duties levied by the U.S.
I participated in the most recent edition of Paper Week in Montreal. I met with industry professionals to discuss new technologies and future steps.
Pulp and paper industry and the forest sector at large continues to thrive.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Mr. Speaker, the Attorney General has been asked point blank if the Prime Minister's office pressured her to make a deal letting SNC-Lavalin off bribery and corruption charges. Her answer? No comment. The Prime Minister has the ability to waive attorney-client privilege and let her speak the truth. Will the Prime Minister let the former Attorney General speak?
Hear, hear.
Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, as regards the previous Minister of Justice and the current Minister of Justice, there has been absolutely no pressure or direction exercised upon either of those 2 individuals by the Prime Minister himself or by anyone in his cabinet on this or any other matter. The allegations contained in the media articles that surfaced yesterday are false, as the Prime Minister stated clearly to journalists in Vaughan.
For Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, every community in Canada has to deal with the challenge of helping people living in homelessness. Canada's first ever national housing strategy included a significant increase in funds for fighting homelessness, and last November, the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development announced that Reaching Home, the redesigned federal homelessness program, will be launching on April 1st of this year. The date is almost upon us. Could the Minister update the House on Reaching Home's implementation?
Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me first thank the member for Etobicoke Centre for his hard work in favour of his families and children in his community. Mr. Speaker, our government committed to working for the most vulnerable among all Canadians, and that's because one homeless Canadian on the streets is one too many in our country. That is why Reaching Home, the new homelessness program, is going to increase the number of communities that will benefit from funding from the federal government. That's why I'm calling upon all these communities to apply for additional funding, and that is why, by working together, we can make sure that we reduce homelessness by at least 50%.
Member for Flamborough-Glanbrook.
Speaker, on Monday, our leader traveled to Willowdale to hear from families and small business owners who are struggling to get by under this Liberal government's policies. There he met pharmacist Mr. Tamer Farag, who voiced his concerns about how the Prime Minister's tax changes are costing him and his community. We know the Prime Minister can't relate to these stories because he's never had to balance a budget or meet a payroll, but the rest of Canada is paying for his mistakes with their hard-earned money. When will the Prime Minister give hard-working Canadians like Mr. Farag a break?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Small Business. Mr. Speaker, our government is working hard to help small businesses and particularly to simplify business processes. On January 1st, we lowered the tax rate to 9%, which allows small businesses to have an additional $7,500 to invest. We also made proposals to reduce credit card rates to effectuate further savings. We are working for small businesses, and we will not stop doing so. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister had indicated he would discuss immigration issues with Quebec. I can tell you that he didn't discuss them for very long. The ink hadn't even dried on the bill when the Quebec government said no. Last week, he refused to discuss knowledge of French as a requirement for citizenship. This week, he's refusing to discuss knowledge of French as a requirement for earlier steps in the immigration process. French language is not a disease, so why is the government refusing to discuss it? Why so much contempt? The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Immigrants play a key role in the Canadian economy and enrich our communities. The Government of Canada and the Government of Quebec have been working together for decades as part of the Canada-Quebec Agreement, and we intend to continue working that way. We have concerns about the bill, but it's too early to say anything about its content. The Honourable Member for El Pontigny. Well, Mr. Speaker, you'll remember that the government had refused to have a real discussion with Quebec about immigration levels, claiming that there's a labour shortage that needed to be addressed. But today, Quebec is working on legislation to address this labour shortage in rural regions as soon as possible. But Ottawa said no to it without even having a single meeting or discussion. If the government believes that labour shortages in the regions are a problem, why won't the government let Quebec solve that problem? The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Immigrants play a key role in the Canadian economy and enrich our communities. The governments of Canada and Quebec have been working together for decades under the Canada-Quebec Agreement, and we intend to continue that important work. We have some concerns about this bill, but it is too early to say anything about its content. The Honourable Member for La Pontigny. Well, this morning, the Prime Minister said no. He closed the door to this. This Quebec bill on immigration was tabled just yesterday. There will be debates in the National Assembly. There will be debates among normal people. And that makes sense, Mr. Speaker, because that's how democracy works. But this morning, the government said that it didn't care about the process at all, and that whatever the result of the process is, it will say no to it. Does the government realize that it is attacking the sovereignty of the National Assembly and its ability to vote for its own bills? The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Of immigration to address labour market shortages and enhance Quebec's economy. The Government of Canada and Quebec have always collaborated for decades under the Canada-Quebec Accord, and we intend to continue this important collaboration. Of course, we have some concerns about this particular bill, but we'll be reviewing this bill with interest. We have to continue to work with the Government of Quebec to ensure that we have an immigration system that continues to work for the best interest of Canadians and Quebecers.
Got time for one more question. The honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, all through question period today, we've asked a very simple question to the Attorney General and to his Parliamentary Secretary, and we still have not had an answer. We know that Gerald Butts met with the former Attorney General to discuss the SNC-Lavalin issue. Very simple question to the Attorney General. Did that discussion include a special deal for the SNC-Lavalin company? Yes or no?
Secretary and Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I too have sat here attentively during the full hour of question period, and I will say again, at no point did the current Minister of Justice or the former Minister of Justice were they pressured or directed by the Prime Minister or anyone in the Prime Minister's office to make any decision on this or any other matter. As I've reiterated, the allegations contained in the Globe and Mail article, as the Prime Minister stated yesterday, are false.